Hello and welcome to NARC Live on Wednesday the 27th of January, coming to you from Norfolk on the east coast of England with Tammy M0TC.
Hello.
And me, David G3UML. Good to see you. On tonight's show, we meet Laurie Margolis G3UML and find out about that QSO with JY1. We hear about a lockdown project from one of the last of the summer wine gang. And we find out who works from a shack like this. Or should be worked, I guess.
It does say work.
It worked, doesn't it? Yeah,
it
I got my script wrong. Anyway, so if you know who that is and you haven't, we've had a few emails and things about that, but if you think you know who worked from a shack like that, it isn't from this country. That's the only clue I'm going to give you. You can quickly put your guess or what you know on BATC or on Facebook, and we'll read them out before we give you the answer in a little while. But first, a bit of club news from you, and I appealed for news on the last newsletter, and thank you very much to those who've responded to that. Firstly, Bob G7JTZ, who's one of course, the last of the summer wine gang. We just can't play that music, can we? Because we'll get taken off again. Probably,
yeah, I haven't got it anyway.
I know. Oh, well, that's a shame. But anyway, so he says, over the last 12 months, I've been repositioning my antenna supports. This involved digging 2 holes about 1 metre square and 1 metre deep. Then mixed 4.5 tons of concrete, all by hand mixer and on his own. That's why we haven't heard from him. So as he said, there's a cubic metre of concrete and weighing 2.2 tons. Wow. One of the supports is a tenor mast, 30 foot, at the back of the workshop and shack, and the other is a flagpole, 25 feet at the bottom of the garden. The total distance between the supports is 86 feet. Now, have an end-fed antenna up, which is 75 foot long, covering 80 to 10 metres, 5 bands. The SWR is very low and is working well. Had good reports from around the UK and Europe. And the only time I need to use the ATU is on 80 metres if I go to either end of the band. So he says, keep safe and thanks for Wednesday nights. You and Tammy are doing a great job. And we're all here just waiting for the jab, he says. Bob G7JT. Good to hear from you, Bob. Thank you. And if you've got a story like that, remember, we would just love to share that with everybody else. So let us know. Drop us pictures or a little story about what you've been doing in this, nearly a year of this now, and we will share it with everybody else. And we're also very grateful to Ken M0KJW, because he told us about this amazing superstation in the States, W5IG, and in particular, how he keeps his transmitter cool. Have a look at this.
Okay guys, well, it's been good talking to you today. I think I'll go ahead and sign off now. Got some things I have to take care of. So, gonna wish you the best of 73, and we'll talk to you a little bit later down the line. W7ATF, K5DJH, this is W5IG. Is off and clear, QRT. Well, after you've been talking on the radio for a while, rag chewing or contesting, you might get tired and a little bit warm. I wanted to introduce myself. I'm W5IG and my name is Lee. And if you get a little bit warm after you're talking and the chat gets a little bit heated, what you can do, stand up and come over here to your cool transmitter. And open it up, get your favorite beverage out, take a drink, do whatever you need to do. If you want something a little bit cooler, you can go up the top part, get some ice cream or a cool fudgesicle or something out of there. And it's always handy to have a cool transmitter on the premises. Now, let me tell you a few things about how we built this thing and how we made it work. It's a kind of an interesting project. First of all, it is a real refrigerator. It is not a real transmitter. It just looks like a transmitter in some places. It's got whatever I found in the junk box for dials and meters and switches, and made some tubes down here out of the flower pots, cut the bottoms out of the little flower vases, put some LEDs in them, and made some mercury vapor rectifiers. And when you talk, there's an RF sensor in here that picks up the RF and makes them flash on and off with the voice. Of course, if you're sending CW, it'll flash with the code, If you're on FM or if you're on AM, it'll stay on all the time. And flashes some of these other lights. Also kicks a couple of meters up here. Makes it look like they're actually working also. What you do is take your refrigerator to fit over the door. I put handles on it so I can open it a little bit easier. Punch it out, put whatever you can find in the junk box on it, you got yourself a transmitter. Happy building, and glad to talk to you again. It's W5IG73.
Thanks very much, by the way, for Ken M0KJW for sharing that video to us. Tonight at 8 is a program that Tammy and I help the RSGB produce, and it's normally at the band on a Monday, one of the first Mondays of the month. And next Monday is the 1st of February, and we're doing another one, and this is called Starting Out on the Microwave Bands. So if you've ever thought about microwave bands and you're interested to see how you get involved, propagation properties, the equipment that you might need, operating on the bands, what sort of license condition or license class that you need indeed, and the resources to help you get you going. All of that is going to be on this program. It's a webinar called Tonight at 8. It's live on Monday at 8 o'clock, and you can find out how to get to it, a link to it, by looking at that website, www.rsgb.org/webinars. And that's something we help the RSGB produce. And Neil Underwood, G4LDR, is an expert on this, and he'll be there presenting that webinar on Monday night. Just to tell you now that club subs, I've been mentioning it for some time now, but they are now due for 2021, and they're at the special rate of £5 instead of the usual rates, because this is going to be an online membership for some time. So if you'd like to, if you haven't yet joined and you'd like to, we ask you to send £5, ideally by a bank. The details are there, and they're also on the website. Or if you want to pay by PayPal, if you can just pay a little bit more, the 46p, that's the fee that PayPal charge us. And that's for a reduced price, full membership though, of Norfolk Amateur Radio Club for the next year, for 2021. Now, Tammy, we come to your part of the programme where every week you surprise us with some little people.
Yep, the little people this week. Let me show you. There you go. The space shuttle launch.
Okay. Oh, and is that one of my least favourite vegetables?
It is. Apparently you can't get a cauliflower anywhere at the moment.
Is that right? Okay. A bit of a shortage of them.
Short supply, yeah. So
that's good. That, because it is one of those pictures, isn't it? You have a quick look at it and you think, is that really cauliflower? I mean, it takes a while. And I hadn't seen this before, so hopefully you're enjoying looking at that at home. So as always, there's a different picture every day, and you can have a look for yourself if you want to have a look at any of these, going to that web address on the bottom left of your screen, miniature-calendar.com. So what have you been doing? Please keep in touch with us. Let us know, just like Bob and Ken did this week. Let us know, send us a story, send us a picture or something like that you've been doing that we can share with other members. Send it to this address, radio@dcpmicro.com. That's radio@dcpmicro.com. Now, as we've been running, this shack story, who works from a shack like this? We've been doing this for some time, and I said that just before Christmas we may not have enough to reach for Christmas, but you're still sending them in, which is brilliant. So if you do want your shack featured, we've got another 4 already now. So I think we'll be well into February, which would be great if we could do it for about a year, wouldn't it? So if you would like to send us your shack, please do. But meantime, we'll show you what we showed you last week. This is the picture from last week. Who worked from a shack like this? And the only clues I said, it wasn't in this country, and it was a little while ago when this person had a home in another country.
we have had a couple of guesses online.
Oh, have we? Good, okay.
We have, if I can just find them. Sunny M0SYW says it's F5VJK, or perhaps better known as G3UML, I believe. I think someone else had a guess as well. Let me just have a quick look. Do you want to read out?
Okay, I'll read out some of the other ones. Rodney G0CBO sent us an email and he said, my guess is Alan G3UML, as he's often spoken about his time in France and the top-class antenna system that he had. Chris G4CCX also said, looks like an FT1000MP Mark V, so could it possibly be Alan G3UML?
Andy M0NKR says he thinks it's Alan G3UML.
And Mark G0LGJ sent us an email as well during the week and said he thinks the shack is also G800 or F5VJK. And so, Tammy, it's up to you. Will you reveal whose shack this was?
It was Alan G800 or Alan F5VJK.
Yep, that's what it was like for him in his, well, beautiful French holiday home a few years ago. I think it was 2017, something like that. Anyway, thank you very much for sending us that, Alan. And for those shacks, as I said, you can keep sending them in. So let's have a look at whose shack it's going to be for this week. Back to something a bit more conventional now. So who works from a shack like this? I'll give you a little while to have a look at that. Bit more conventional.
A bit of construction going on there.
That's true, yeah. Is that that looks, and I'm just really having a look at this for the first time in detail. That little blue bit of equipment on the bench there looks like that might be something pie colour, you know, PYE. They made equipment that was always that sort of light blue colour, Pie Telecommunications. Other clues from that? Well, as always, there's some test equipment there. Look, top right. This picture will be on our website, of course, in the next couple of days, and will be there until next Wednesday. You need to tell us whose shack you think that is by next Wednesday at 3 o'clock. Okay. Right, good luck with that. Now, just a few details about what's happening this week at the club. On Monday night, it's the Monday Night Net on GB3NB with Steve G3EVA hosting. And next Wednesday, the 3rd of February, for NARC Live, we've got Chris G3SVL with the DXpedition funding and the role of DX foundations. I don't know if we can see that, Tammy. So there we are. Now, this is a very important part of our hobby, of course, but it does take some funding. And Chris works with the organisation that deals with that at the RSGB, and he's going to tell us how that things are funded, how some of these exotic DXpeditions are funded. So that's next week on NARC Live. As I said, please send your pictures and things to us at the usual address, radio@dcpmicro.com. Just send the info to us there. And if you want to find out what's happening in terms of radio in Norfolk, then you can check out this slide, which is always on our website. There we are, Norfolk on the Air. And our web address is at www.norfolkamateurradio.org. Just checking, and if we keep looking around, which we don't normally do at this, we're just checking that we're getting out there, and we think we are.
I think the BATC is not great, to be honest.
Okay, so I think the message, from what we can see, is that if you can look at Facebook, and it's an easy one to remember actually. If you go to Facebook, you don't need to sign in. It might ask you to sign in, but if you don't have a Facebook account, go to www.facebook.com/Norfolk Amateur Radio Club, all as one word. Norfolk Amateur Radio Club. So it's /Norfolk Amateur Radio Club. That will take you straight to our page, and you should be able to pick up the video there. But I don't think it's great. Sorry, but I think the audio is okay. So we're going to proceed and carry on. Oh, and I must just tell you about this as well. I do mention this every week. We always send one or two of these cards out to anybody who's just feeling unwell or has got an anniversary or a birthday or something to celebrate. We'll be very happy to send one of these Norfolk Amateur Radio Club cards. So just drop us an email with a name and address if you'd like to send it to, and we'll add your name, of course, to it as well, and tell us a little reason why as well, so we send it appropriately to them. Okay, well now we have reached our main event. I do hope that the signal is getting to you better now at home, because we've got a guest with us tonight. Most of you will actually have seen tonight's guest many times over the years, because he's a very well-travelled BBC reporter and now a news editor. But as well as that, he's also a committed radio amateur, and so we're really looking forward to meeting him. So welcome to NARC for Laurie Margolis G3UML. Laurie.
Good evening, David. I'm sort of seeing it coming back on Facebook, so I assume we are broadcasting to the world, or everybody who wants to listen, are we?
I hope so. We haven't got the resources of the BBC, as no doubt you'll realise, but it's a shame because we've been doing this for a long time, and only last week really and this week we've got these particular problems which I think are internet based. So We're certainly going to have a look at them, but we're going to keep on because we also do record this locally, digitally. So if for some reason the internet's bad, we can obviously upload this later on as well. So I don't think it'll be wasted, as long as we've got the decent connection to you, that is, of course.
Yeah, fine. Well, I'm seeing a reasonably good picture on Facebook, a little bit jerky, but there we are. Well, very good evening, everybody, and very nice to, not quite sure how many of you are out there, but very nice to talk to you. Norfolk is one of our favourite parts of the world. We try each year to get to Brancaster Beach, and Thornham and up in that area. Didn't make it last year, of course, because it wasn't very suitable for touring around, but it's a great part of the world and we really enjoy it. What I'm going to do here is talk just a little bit about me as a radio ham, me as a BBC journalist. Then I'm going to go into a couple of stories, specific stories, which I hope you'll find interesting. Then depending on how we go for time, I might go over some stuff about what I've specialised in, which is working a lot of DX with very simple antennas. I'm here in the London suburbs, Hendon, near the Brent Cross Shopping Centre, if you know it, near the North Circular Road. Not a very promising location, but I've done okay here. And that can often take us on to other sort of DX-related discussions. I'm entirely happy to take questions and interventions as we go along. I'm not quite sure how that works because the only person I'm seeing on screen is me.
We'll ask you them, Laurie. So it's as you say, it's great for people at home watching. If you think of any questions at all that you'd like to ask Laurie, you can ask them throughout the show. If there are things that we think should be asked there and then, we'll do it. We'll certainly pass them on immediately to Laurie, or we might leave some of them until the end. But over to you, Laurie.
Fine, no problem. Well, as I say, I'm seeing myself coming back here and I'm loving it. So we've got one satisfied customer. So
we've got about 80 people, by the way. Sorry, Laurie. We've got about 80 people now watching, 52 on Facebook and 28 on BATC. So that's not bad. Excellent.
Well, 80 times good evening to all of you. So I'm G3 Uniform Mike Leamer. Got my license in August 1964. 65, I beg your pardon. I'm jumping the gun there. I was very lucky because my father was involved in amateur radio. He was the late G3NMR, came on the air in 59, and I sort of got interested when he did in 57 and 58 when I was 7 or 8 years old. So, but you know, by the time I was an older primary school kid, I was pretty familiar with the bands and knew what DX was and knew my way around a receiver and so on. Came on in 1965. Very fortunate again because I started with a full Heath SB line, which was a good station in those days. We had a tower in the garden, I think a cubicle quad at first, and then a TH6 on a 60-foot tower. So working DX was relatively easy, and I'd worked 100 countries in 9 days, 200 in about 3 months, and you know, was well up into the 300s by the time I was in my late teens, early 20s. I then, this was all in Ilford, Essex, a very small suburban garden in just off the North Circular Road in Ilford. And I then, time moved on, I left that area in my late 20s, settled in northwest London, got married there, and then decided to come back on the air from my current QTH in Hendon NW4 in 1980. So I will get to that a bit later on, but just to say I've been around a long time, mostly as an HFDXer. I like HFDX, I like contests. I've never really got over the thrill of how amateur radio works. Aren't we unbelievably fortunate having this hobby in these peculiar times? I can honestly say in getting on for 60 years now as a licensed amateur, I've never appreciated it more. Just had one wonderful example this week. A couple of days ago, I was knocking around on 17 meters during the day, and conditions were actually quite good to VK. There were a couple of quite loud VK2s coming in on single sideband. We go to Australia a lot because my older daughter lives in Sydney. I have the call VK2UML, and we have 2 grandchildren there as well. Fortunately, one of whom we managed to see for the first 3 weeks of her life just before everything closed down on us. So on one earlier trip quite recently, we went to Canberra, down to Canberra, which is about 3 hours drive south of Sydney, and is basically a little enclave surrounded by New South Wales. And just near Canberra is a lovely little town called Yass with a very, very good restaurant. So I called the first VK2 Sugar Radio, and he says he's just outside Canberra. And I mentioned this place at Yass, and he said, "Oh," he said, "love the place. A G3 friend was out here a few years ago. We went there and had a great lunch and always wanted to go back." So I said, "Well, you should go. It's still very good." On the way back from that trip, driving towards Sydney, you go through an area called the Southern Highlands, which is about an hour south of Sydney. And there's a town called Bowral, which any of you who are interested in cricket will know as the birthplace of Sir Donald Bradman. And we stopped there. It was late afternoon, and we thought we'd get a bite to eat. There was a pub there which opened at 6 o'clock, and we walked around for about half an hour. So going back to what happened this week, as soon as I finished with VK2SR, I hit VK2XZ and called him, took a couple of goes, and he comes back, and he was in Bowral. So it was like kind of recreating that lovely day we had 4 or 5 years ago, coming back from Canberra to just on the air. So we are very fortunate with this hobby that we have. I have never got over just the thing of pumping some electricity into some wires in the garden, and my voice appears 10, 12,000 miles away, and the same thing happens the other way. I know you can do it on the phone, I know you can do it on WhatsApp, and I know there's other ways of doing it, but somehow the way we do it seems a more pure, almost environmentally correct thing, and I've never got fed up with it. So me professionally, I've now worked at BBC News since 1974, which makes me, I think, the longest serving person in BBC News. I think the great John Simpson, our foreign editor, may have been there longer, although he's been there on a sort of freelance basis for some years. But there's not many who've been around longer than me. So I joined in 74, began in local radio in Sheffield, then joined a BBC training scheme in London, worked in the radio newsroom, became a radio reporter, then became a television reporter in the late 80s and early 90s, working on network news TV stories all over the world. Then in the mid-90s, I became a news desk editor, which I remain to this day. So what does a news desk editor do? I sit in the newsroom in Portland Place, in New Broadcasting House, in that room you see at the beginning of each bulletin, that big sort of shot they do down into it. Haven't actually been in there for a year for obvious reasons. We have been working from home. It's worked reasonably well. It's not perfect, but it's worked reasonably well. And I'm of a certain age where I want to be perhaps a little bit more careful than some of the young uns. So I have taken the opportunity to work entirely from home, and I won't be back in the newsroom before March. So it could actually be a year that I've been out there. But having said that, I've been working full time from home. And thanks to electronics and Zoom and the internet and laptops and all the rest of it, it's worked reasonably well. So that's what I've been doing. My job entails, I work, any news organisation has two sides to it. It has the news production side, who are the people who actually put the stuff on the air, prepare the pictures, write the scripts, work with the newsreaders, actually put the stuff on the air and eventually into your television. And there is the news gathering side, which is what I do, which is the people who are out there. So working as reporters, as correspondents, as cameramen, as satellite engineers, basically the ones who go out there to get the raw material into which we put television news bulletins. So that's what I've always worked on that side, either as a reporter or as a news desk editor. And my job on a day-to-day basis is to make sure that the programs I'm working for get the material that is available and the material they decide they want, and get to cover the stories they want to cover. So depending on what day it is, on different days, I am either the news editor for television news, which is the 1, the 6 and the 10 o'clock news you see on BBC One, for the news channel, which is the continuous news service that you get on 503 on Sky if you watch it that way, which we put a lot of effort into these days, or network radio, which is essentially the main news bulletins at 7, 8, 1, 6, 10 and midnight, and working alongside 5 Live, not directly to 5 Live, but we do a lot with 5 Live. So right across the whole of the BBC. In addition, of course, we do have an enormous website now, which again, I don't work for directly, but our department is kind of a source department. We produce the source stuff that ends up going out everywhere. So that is what I do. I was or have been on radio and on television a lot, less so these days. My job now is not being on screen, although I still creep on occasionally, as you will see a little bit later on, I hope. So that is my professional life. So if anybody wants to ask anything about that, more than happy to to engage with you about that. So what I'm going to talk about now are a couple of major stories that I got involved in, absolutely unique stories, which I got involved in through amateur radio, which were found and covered and developed through amateur radio, and yet became major stories on all media, television, radio, and newspapers throughout the world. There's been a few of these over the years, but two of the biggest I've been lucky enough to be central to, and they followed me around through life, and they're things I'm glad to have sort of in my personal history. So let me take you to 1970. I'm 20, I'm 19 actually at the beginning of 1970. And I've been on the air for about 5 years. I'm a student. I'm studying electronics, actually, electronic engineering at Qsl College in London. To be honest, I'm not very good at it, actually, and I managed eventually to escape engineering and go into journalism. But nevertheless, that's what I thought I wanted to do. And then I realized it was actually quite hard, and I wasn't very good at the maths. And what I enjoyed as a hobby was not necessarily going to work as a full-time occupation. So anyway, 1970, I'm just coming sort of halfway through my first year at Qsl College, quite enjoying it. And I'm on the air. I'm living at home much of that year, and I'm on the air at home one afternoon. And I'm reading in the DX bulletins that King Hussein of Jordan has come on the air. He's become a radio ham, and he is JY1. That's his call sign. As most of you will know, JY is Jordan, and he got number one because he was number one in Jordan. And this was of some interest to me. It didn't mean anything to me particularly, but I'd always been interested in Middle East politics. I've been to, ended up going to the Middle East a lot, both personally and professionally over the next few years, but meant nothing more to me other than this rather famous person was on the air. And it would be nice to get hold of him. So I'm listening around one afternoon on 20 meters. And it's always, looking back through my logbooks, there's always been a little bit of puzzlement there, because those of you who were around in 1970 will remember conditions were fantastic. That 10 meters was wide open, 15 meters was wide open. We didn't have 12 and 17 in those days, but conditions were really good. You really could go on with 50 watts and a bit of wet string and work some serious DX. For some reason that afternoon I was on 20 meters and listening right up the top of 20 meters. I don't know why. And there on 14306, who do I hear but JY1 with a very big signal. And it is obviously him. You recognize his voice, very fluent, well-spoken English, but with a distinct sort of Arabic accent there. And there is JY1. And I looked at thought, this is good. And to be honest, as interested as I was that he was JY1, that he was the king of Jordan, I hadn't actually worked Jordan at that stage. It was a new country for me. So I thought, right, get in there, it will be country number 282. And 282 was a decent score in the 1970s. So bear in mind, I had a very good station then. We were running, shall we say, adequate power. I had a 6-element beam at 60 feet. So most stuff I shouted at came back, gave him a call, and he came straight back. And I don't recall there being an enormous amount of QRM or competition up there, being up above 14,300. I'm not sure why he was up there. There was no cluster in those days. So now there'd be like 10,000 people on him in seconds, but then you had to tune around and find your own DX. And I called him and he came back, and we had a very nice QSO and, rig, weather, name, the rest of it. And my father was at home, and I say my father was G3NMR, and he happened to be at home that afternoon. And he came running in and heard this, and I said to JY1, I've got my father here, G3NMR, would you mind working in? Yes, of course, very delighted to do that. And he worked my dad. And I always thought, being a king, he kind of rather liked this hereditary idea that a father did something and a son did something and the next son did something. So we had QSOs, and here are the Qsl cards. So this is the one that I got from him. And if you look on the back, March the 20th, 1970, I'm not sure if this is showing up.
That's fine. That's looking good, actually. Yeah, if you just hold it, that's it. And if you could just hold it fairly still there, Laurie, that'd be great. Oh, wow.
So I can see actually he only gave me 5 and 5, which surprised me a bit. I would have thought it might have been stronger there, but anyway. And there's quite a long handwritten message. It was a pleasure for me to contact you, my good friend. I hope we will have a future contact soon. Kindly accept my best wishes and regards. Sincerely, Hussein. Very nice. And here's another card. This is the one that went to my dad, G3 Norway Mexico radio. Interestingly enough, his call sign seems to be typed out. I'm not sure how come that came about, but anyway, must have had someone there doing his typing. But again, very nice message. I hope we'll meet again, and I wish to assure you it was a pleasure to contact you. Sincerely, Hussein. And typed in all best wishes to you, my good friend. I remember listening to him around on the bands after that. Needless to say, once it became known who he was kind of getting deluged, thinking he's going to be spending a hell of a lot of time writing Qsl cards if he's going to be putting messages that long on. But so we had this contact. Let me jump you forward into the summer. I'm in the United States, and it's not going terribly well. I've done my end of first year exams, and as I was increasingly coming to fear, I hadn't actually done very well, and was going to have to come back in September to do some resits to go into the second year of my course. Fortunately, I'd done quite well in electronics, which was the main one, but the physics and the maths around the edge I hadn't done that well in, so that was going to have to be redone. I went to the States that summer for 3 months, my first trip there, and that also was not an entire success, in that I was a camp counselor at a camp in Pennsylvania, and it became really the only time in my life I actually got fired. Not a great feeling, to those of you who've had it will know, and certainly not if you're a 20-year-old student in a strange country. But I managed to find my feet, and had some very good friends there, and ended up working in a department store in Long Island, and had a pretty good time. But instead of staying till the end of September like I'd always intended, I had to come back early to do these wretched resits. So came back to London, I think it was about the 5th or 6th of September 1970, and it was kind of kicking off in Jordan. Now, what had happened then, you must remember, 1967 was the Six-Day War, when Israel conquered the West Bank, seized it from Jordan with East Jerusalem, conquered the Golan Heights from Syria, conquered Sinai from Egypt and Gaza, pretty much trebled its own size and changed the shape of the Middle East in ways that are still unresolved today, very much so. So Jordan had been kicked out of the West Bank. There were an enormous number of Palestinian refugees in the East Bank, if you like, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. The PLO were developing very quickly as a protest against Israel seizing what they saw as Palestinian land. And it was all very volatile, and there was terrorism going on all over the place. There were attacks on Israel. The Israelis were retaliating. You might remember that the PLO hijacked 3 jetliners to an old RAF base in Jordan called Dawson's Field and blew them up. There was a woman called Layla Khaled who became very prominent then. And it was a very volatile time. And a full-scale civil war broke out in Jordan. The PLO wanted to take over Jordan. King Hussein, who was basically British-backed or Western-backed, he went to Harrow, went to Sandhurst. The upper echelons of his army were all British-trained. They found themselves in a full-scale civil war with the PLO, and it was a very dangerous situation. Now, I was still a student. I wasn't a journalist then, but even then I remember that there was no coverage from Jordan at all. All the journalists had to leave. And what you saw in the papers was stuff written from Cyprus or from Beirut or from Cairo or from Jerusalem, based on kind of intercepted radio and radio broadcasts from Jordan and from the PLO's broadcast outlets. There was no coverage from the place at all. There were hardly any pictures coming out. We heard reports of these massive battles going on, but very few pictures came out. The pictures that did come out, it was long before we had proper video, we had satellites, we had the sort of ways we source pictures these days. Stuff was shot on film. It was then flown out eventually to usually London or New York, where it was processed, and it got on the air. And it got on, and much of it was very, very good stuff. But it was a slow and laborious process getting this stuff out. So I'd been home a few days, and I was interested in this without particularly registering it, and was sort of attempting to revise for these exams I was going to have to do at the end of September. And I was listening around on 20 meters late one night, about 11:30 at night. And I should say, I was in my parents' house. My father, as I say, was G3NMR. My mother, who any of you go back a long way might remember, was a lady called Laurie Margolis, who was very involved with RSGB and with the Amateur Radio Mobile Society. She became the first public relations officer for RSGB, never took her license, always thought that Ohm's law should be repealed. But She knew what we were about. She wrote often for the American CQ magazine for 73. And she'd also, rather late on, developed a career as a bit of a radio personality. She started doing stuff for Woman's Hour in the 60s, got much busier when BBC Local Radio started and Radio London started up in 1970. And she was pretty well working full-time as a radio personality on programmes like Woman's Hour, You and Yours on Radio 4. She did some special documentaries on Radio 4, and then she became a fairly big figure with BBC Radio London, and this continued to her death in 1977. My father died in 73, I should say. And they were at home. So I'm listening around on 20 metres, and there is an enormous signal with a familiar voice, and it's JY1, and he's working somebody in Minnesota, and having a fairly normal QSO. Now, bear in mind, this is a guy whose country is in the middle of, who is running a country that is in the middle of a civil war, who may well lose his throne, who with dealing with this enormous situation on his own, on his own, guiding his relatively small army. And there he is one night sitting on 20 metres talking to a W0 in Minnesota. And I thought this was a bit strange. So wandered upstairs, Mum and Dad were still awake, and said to my mum, who, as I say, was already working for the Today programme then as well at times. I said, do you find it odd if you were a king in the middle of a country in civil war and mayhem going on around you to be sitting on 20 metres working a W0? And she thought this was a bit strange, and she rang a contact on the Today programme, and the following morning the Today programme sent around one of their radio cars, big taxi, of which we still use versions of that to this day, to the house. I had recorded some of his contact. I hadn't actually gone in on the contact. I just listened to it, recorded some of his stuff talking about what was going on there, and they gave it to the Today programme, and they played this stuff out, and it caused a little bit of a sensation because there was this story where we were getting no coverage at all. All of the coverage was coming from other countries. No one knew what was going on, except there was the king of the country bang in the middle of it, sitting on 20 metres talking about it. So you haven't got to be the world's Pulitzer Prize winning journalist to work out this is quite a good story. So goes on a few more days, and we suddenly start getting a lot of interest from the media. And a few days later, I think it was actually September the 17th, 1970, I'm listening around on 15 metres, and there is JY1 with a big signal. And again, talking about his experiences. And I call him. And we had a good station. He would have heard me. He was loud. I was loud. And I said, sir, I am recording what you're saying, and, we will make it available to the media. Just wonder how you're getting on and what you're doing. And the first thing that surprised me was he remembered the previous contact 6 months ago. There was no computer logging in those days, so he must have just remembered the voice or the call sign or something. He said, "Oh, my friend, very nice to see you again. I know we spoke already with your father." And he proceeded to tell me that, we had a very difficult situation and we're doing our best, and there is a lot of fighting and it's very difficult. And to be honest, in terms of facts, it was a bit short, but it was coming from, to say the horse's mouth sounds a bit insulting, but it was coming from the man at the dead centre of the story, at the bullseye of the story. So I recorded some of this stuff, sent it over to the BBC, or told the BBC it was available, and it went crazy. And we had, night after night, we had BBC, ITV, we had foreign television. We'll play you a little bit of videotape in a moment, but this was the scene in it was our dining room, actually, the room where we had our radio station. That guy, the one sitting down is me, the one standing up is my dad. There is a big BBC TV. That's not a film camera, that's an outside broadcast camera, which is being set up there. Here is another one. This, I think, was on ITN. Another one, me by the rig with the full panoply of the broadcast world around me. Here's another one still. This is certainly ITN because it says ITN on the camera. And again, this is what was going on in the dining room of our little terraced house in Ilford. Great big broadcast towers outside. CBS were there, French television were there. The papers were turning up as well. David, I think you've got a clip of video of this, which I'll talk about afterwards. Can you run this now?
Yeah, we're going to run it now. This is from the Pathé, British Pathé site.
JY1, G3 United Mexico Lima in London. G3 United Mexico Lima in London, over.
I'm not hearing the audio on it. Is it going out?
It is, yes, Laurie. Sorry,
Okay, no problem.
we can't give you clean feed, but okay.
G3 United Mexico Lima. G3 United Mexico Lima. J11. Coming.
Roger, Your Majesty. Good evening. This is G3UML near London. I'm just listening to you talking. I don't know whether we can assist you at all in contacting your wife. I am quite close to London.
If you could get in touch with the embassy with a Miss May.
Please repeat that name if you can. JY1 G3UML. Go ahead.
Roger, it is Mike Alpha Echo. Cook. Charlie Oscar Kilo Echo.
Roger, what is the number? What is the number? Over.
Just stand by one, I'll check.
Roger.
Roger, my friend. It's either 937-7939, 937-7939, or Western 9544, 9544. Over.
Roger, I have both those numbers. What is the message, please? What is the message, please? Over.
Just to pass Princess Mona and the family my very best, and to tell them all is fine, and we're all fine here, and not to worry. Over.
Roger, okay, fine. I don't know if you can say how things are there and how you are. I presume everything is fine. Very glad to hear you, and I will be listening out for you, and if there is any other message to come back, I will be around here. JY1 G3UML, go ahead.
So bad, lots of damage and lots of losses, but we hope that it will be the turning point, and maybe something better in every way and respect will develop here, and we will rebuild something that is very much better than anything that has been there in the past.
I think that's it, isn't it, Laurie?
You might find this hard to believe. I did not know that that video existed until about 6 months ago. I had occasionally sort of Googled to see if anything appeared, anything was there from that era. Obviously, it's long before the internet existed, and always showed up a zilch. And then I was preparing a piece for CQ magazine to run on the 50th anniversary of all of this, which was in September last year. And just ran it through Google again, and suddenly that thing pitched up, and it's actually ITN material, which is rather ironic considering I've spent my life working for the opposition. It's in the Pathé Library, and I had never seen it. All I ever saw at the time, there was no such thing as video recorders at the time in 1970, so couldn't record it myself. You couldn't record television programs. I obviously, some of it was live, so obviously I was aware of that. Some of it I saw on the news bulletins afterwards, but only the once. But I have never seen that sort of 2 or 3 minute clip of video, and it still sends a bit of a shiver up my spine. It was an extraordinary moment.
Just a reminder,
So, anyway,
Laurie, sorry to interrupt, but just a reminder that you were 20 at that time, weren't you? I mean,
I was just 20.
do you think you realised at that time how significant that was?
Yeah, no, I got that because I was already kind of tending towards journalism. I thought this was where I was going to go. And bear in mind, as I say, my mum had, she had quite good news connections. And so I kind of knew. There'd been a couple of earlier stories I'd been involved in, which had got a little bit of media coverage. During the Prague Spring, when the Russians invaded Prague in 1968, I got some messages from, believe it or not, Czech ships. Now, you may wonder how Czechoslovakia had ships, but it's completely land-bound, but there was a Czech merchant marine, and I'd recorded some stuff and spoken to some of them, warning them not to put into ports in the communist bloc. And there was a massive earthquake in Nicaragua, I think was in 1969, also where the only coverage was amateur radio. This is how it used to happen in those days. Mm. The only coverage was amateur radio, and I had, again, I think recorded some stuff and passed it on to the media then. So I wasn't a complete novice in this. And it was obviously a very good story. So it went on for several days where I had contacts with him. Broadcast media were turning up. I was appearing on various programs in London, early evening news programs and that sort of thing. And it was all great fun. I was trying to do a bit of revision at the same time, which was a bit difficult, but I was already thinking this journalism lark is actually not bad. I think I might fancy sticking with this. So anyway, it kind of died off a bit, and we went through. I checked my logbooks a few months ago, and I had, in total, between the first and the last, eight contacts with him over a period of about 3 or 4 weeks. And we got into October, and the story had kind of died away, and there were 1 or 2 reporters were getting in there. He had sort of won his civil war. He defeated the PLO, and they ended up in refugee camps, mostly in Lebanon, which again blew up years later, and was, is still not properly resolved. I got a call from there used to be a program, some of you will remember, called Nationwide, which used to come on after the BBC One Tea Time News. Used to come on at 6 o'clock, and the first half hour was the local program, so it would have been Look East in for most of you, and then the second half hour was more national. And they rang up and said, "Oh, we're doing some filming about this. Can we come over and do some filming with you this afternoon for a program?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Look, I've got to tell you, I've not spoken to him for 7 or 10 days, so I can't be sure he's going to come on." But they said, "Oh, well, we'll give it a try." So they turn up, this team, and they're setting up in the dining room again with, there's a whole lot of people. There was a producer and a production assistant and a reporter and a cameraman, sound man, lighting man. I mean, no, it would just turn up with 1 or 2 people, but there were much bigger teams in those days. And I said, look, I've not heard him for a while, but they said, "Oh, well, can you just tune around and see what you can hear?" And I'd go on, I think it was 20 meters, and called CQ, and I think a Lithuania station called me, and we had this contact, and they were filming that. And these guys had been doing another story all day, and they were clearly a bit fed up and couldn't quite see the point of this, and to be honest, neither could I. Except that 5 seconds later, out of the signal at about 30 over 9, G3UML, it's JY1. I went, wow. I said, sort of turned around and said, "It's him." And there was this kind of electric charge went through the room, and we had this contact, which they filmed in full, again with huge signals. What you may have gathered from the video that we ran before was that his wife, Princess Muna, who was actually from your part of the world, she was from Ipswich. She was a woman called Tony Gardner originally. She was in the UK. She was staying in London. And we were actually passing some messages to her, not that we're going on the media, but we were actually passing messages backwards and forwards to her. So that was his concern and his interest, and the number that he gave me that you heard there was actually the Jordanian embassy in West London. So we had this contact, and they slammed that on Nationwide, and they had me on there, and again the whole thing kind of took off again. Anyway, eventually it went quiet. It's a story that's kept following me around. 2 or 3 other things I would mention while we're on this. About 2 or 3 months later, the King appeared in hospital in London. He was suffering from exhaustion. He'd hardly slept properly for about 3 or 4 months, and he came to a private hospital in the West End of London called the Bryanston Clinic, and was in there. And we got a call from his PA, that woman May Cook, who was mentioned in that in that clip. And she said, "The King would very much like to meet you and your father if you could come up here." So fine. So up we go. And I should say Bryanston Square is a smart Georgian square in Marylebone, behind Selfridges kind of thing. And this hospital, I'm not sure if it's still there, but it was there. And of course, he managed to get a beam on the roof of the hospital. I mean, it helps if you're a king that you can do stuff like that. He had the call sign G5ATM. He had a station up there. He was operating, and of course was, this blasting signal from the West End of London. And my dad and I went up there, and we were in this little private hospital room that he was in. Him in his dressing gown, I remember, sitting on the side of the bed. Me and my dad, just shooting the breeze for about half an hour. You're going to ask me what we said. I can't remember, to be honest. Nothing was recorded. I haven't even got a still picture of it. But we sat up there with him. Most extraordinary experience. Go forward another year, I am making my first trip to Israel, and I'm operating a contest from a very big station there was then up in the north of Israel, 4Z4HF, and we're in I think it was the WAE, the Europe contest in late August, and I'm on there working strings of Europeans, huge signals into this very good location. And suddenly there's this enormous voice comes across, "Hello, my good friend, how are you?" And I was being a bit slow. I said, "Sorry, who was that?" And he came back and said, "It's your very good friend to the east." And I thought, oh my God. Now, I should say in the room were a bunch of Israeli radio hands watching me operate. there was JY1. It wasn't actually legal to work from Israel to Jordan. Probably was from Jordan to Israel because he made the laws, but it's certainly the other way. It actually wasn't. It wasn't permitted. But these guys were listening to it, completely got thunderstruck by King Hussein coming out of the loudspeaker of this radio in Israel, talking to me, knowing I was in Israel. And it was all, best wishes to everybody and salam alaikum and shalom aleichem and all this kind of stuff. And another memory. Let me wind on to 1999. As I say, this story keeps following me around. Every now and then I get rung up by the papers. There's some vaguely relevant story to this, and what do I think about it? 1999, I am doing the job I'm doing now, which is as a news editor. I go into work one bright sunny morning in July on a Sunday morning, 7:30. I don't think I've been into the office for about a week beforehand. So we were in the days, we had email, we had internet, we were kind of coming into the foreign mobile phones, we were kind of coming into the modern era. And I turn on my emails, as I usually did, 7:30 in the morning, just read myself in, see what was going to be happening during the day. And there is an email there from an organisation called Brillstein Associates, which I'd never heard of. And it said, "Dear Mr. Margolis, we have read your article in Harper's Magazine. Very interested. We feel this has the basis for a motion picture. Would you please contact us to discuss whether we can take this any further?" And I kind of looked at this and thought, what the hell is this about? This is a wind-up or something. Go further down my emails, lots of routine ones there. And there's another one. And this is from Universal Pictures. Now, I've heard of Universal Pictures. Mm-hmm. Exactly the same sort of thing. "Dear Mr. Margolis, we've been made aware of the article you wrote in Harper's Magazine. We're very interested in this, a great story, and we think it has the potential to be developed as a motion picture. Could you please contact us?" And I thought, what the heck is going on here? Now, you might wonder what Harper's Magazine is. So I go, this is Harper's Magazine. This is the one. You can see there's a piece there called "The King and I" by me. Mm-hmm. And what this magazine is there's a very, very rude front cover, but you can see it's quite sort of, ignore the front cover, but you can see it's quite a sort of academic looking thing. It's a kind of very posh Reader's Digest. And they take articles from all over the media, home and abroad, run extracts of them. And it's still running as far as I know. And I had done a piece for CQ about 6 months or a year before when King Hussein died. And CQ, there was this massive funeral which they had in Amman. About 4 US presidents turned up. I think Reagan turned up, Carter turned up, whoever was, Gerald Ford, I think, turned up. I think Prince Charles turned up for us. It was a massive thing. And I'd done a piece, a very short notice for CQ. They contacted me and said, "Look, we need it. We're on deadline. Can you literally do something in the next 2 hours?" Which I was used to deadlines, which I did. This piece was extracted by Harper's Magazine and was picked up by these film companies. So I remember ringing my wife and said, "Hollywood wants to make a film about me." And she said, "Yes, dear, of course they do." And I mentioned it to my daughters, and they're already thinking where we're going to live, Malibu, Beverly Hills, and all the rest of it. And anyway, I had conversations with these people, and to cut a very long story short, nothing really came of it. I never, thinking about it, I never quite thought there was the potential there for a whole film. I could see the see the interest and see the interesting point, but in some ways, kind of once you'd said it. Now, one of the people I spoke to, he was a fairly senior guy at Universal, who was very interesting, and he said, "Laurie," he said, "I want to tell you," he said, "great stories, great motion pictures are about the meeting between totally opposite people, the prince and the pauper, the people, the rich and the poor, the powerful and the not so powerful." And in this case, it was the king and a 20-year-old Jewish student sitting in East London. And that's what they thought they could see. It didn't come of anything. They suggested I got in touch with one of the British movie companies. I never did. Then a friend who had a bit of a record producing programs for the BBC relatively recently, about 7 or 8 years ago, wanted to develop it and take it further. And she got to writing treatments and things like that. But it just never quite happened. And I still think it's a great story and it's great to talk about. And it's very unusual. I'm not quite sure it's a major motion picture coming to you. So that is the JY1 story, major part in my life. It certainly turned me into being a journalist. pretty major part in the life of the Middle East, actually, because it was never the same after that. And I think a fairly major part for amateur radio in that, certainly in those days, in the days before cell phones, satellites, WhatsApp, Facebook, where now you expect to see wars covered literally as the shells are falling on top of you, covered live. None of that was possible in those days. There was great television coverage, but not with that instantaneous element to it. And that's what we did. Are there any questions? Normally when I've done this before, there's a few questions.
There is a couple of things, Laurie. And also we did have that picture, if you remember. I'm sorry, putting Tammy on the spot now. Yes, we had that picture which we can show you, which we found on qrznow.com.
Yep.
And someone, while we look at that, actually, someone mentioned Victor sent us a message. Victor Brand sent us a message and said, "Read the King, I was glad to see the photos of him years ago when he was besieged in the palace, sitting in front of his Drake TR7 radio, through which he kept in touch with the outside world. And at the time," Victor says, "that he had the same rig," which is wonderful.
Yeah, well, I know Victor very well. If you're listening, Victor, good evening. Yes, it's quite right. He was very, very keen. It wasn't just some sort of passing fad. He was JY1. His wife was actually JY2, although I'm not sure if she ever got on the air. He had a kind of a sort of Boswell to his Johnson, if you like, a kind of number 2 called Captain Zaza, who was JY1/B, who was on all the time. And King Hussein became a good operator. He became good at handling pile-ups. He certainly wasn't handwriting his QSL cards like that. But I have to say, we got a Christmas card from him every year, really right up to the time he died. I've got them amazing. Around somewhere, always with a picture. He sort of got through wives fairly quickly, but with a picture of the current wife. Actually, I'm sorry, there is one other thing I should tell you in relation to this. I was in Jordan in the 1990s. It may have been over the turn of the late 1990s. Anyway, it was after he was still alive, I should say. I was sent there to anchor the BBC coverage there, to produce the BBC coverage there, because the Gulf War was going on in Iraq. There was worries that the Iraqis were going to try and attack Israel. Israel would try and attack the Iraqis. The Jordanians would be in the middle of this. So I was actually in Jordan, and I was there for about a month. And I put in a bid fairly early on. I was really interested to talk, not so much to the King. I think they'd let it be known he wasn't going to be doing any interviews, but to his wife, because his wife at the time was American. She was the daughter of the guy who ran Pan American World Airways at the time. She'd been an air hostess, a woman called Lisa Halaby from New York, of Palestinian origin, but all-American girl, very beautiful woman. And they had got married, and she had become the Queen of Jordan. And I found her position really interesting because there was a lot of anti-American feeling in Jordan. So soon after we got there, I put in this formal bid to the palace to do an interview with her. Heard nothing at all, and it was a good 2 or 3 weeks later. We all had flu. I was in my hotel room in the Marriott in Amman, sort of sweating and feeling awful, and none of us felt well. The phone goes, "Oh, Mr. Margolis, it's the Royal Palace. The Queen will be very pleased to talk to you at 4 o'clock. It was now about 2:10. Fine, great. So dose myself up with Anodin and tell everybody, sorry guys, we're working. And off we go to the Royal Palace, and we set up there, and I'm looking as good as someone with flu is ever going to look. She comes in looking like some, incredible supermodel. And we did about half an hour. We did a lovely interview, a big chunk of which went out on breakfast news. So again, another part of that. If there's nobody else who wants to
Well, there is a couple of things, actually.
Sure,
I mustn't forget to mention that someone you already know, Paul Courtright, G3SEM, is his call sign, but he says he wants to be remembered to you as UKI 826.
I remember him well, several stories. I think the last one would have been, what was the dreadful murder in north of Cambridge, Soham.
I don't think it was him.
No, he didn't know. I think he worked on it. I don't think he did it.
Yes, no, I mean, Paul is local to us now, and he was a producer at Look East and lots of other things. A few years ago, he came and did us a lovely talk at the club to tell us all his work in outside broadcast, some of the early days of outside broadcast. But he wanted to be remembered to you anyway, so.
Lovely. Very good.
And a couple of other things, if I may, before we move on, because I know you're going to talk about another part of your life now. Steve Ayres, G3 EVA, who is the host of our Monday Night Net, as he says, on Monday, someone said that the JY1 actually came to Norfolk Amateur Radio Club in all those many, many years ago. So we're not sure about that. So if you're watching this and you're watching this on Facebook or on BATC and you remember that or you know anything about it, we'd love to see a bit of information. I'm sure Laurie would like to know as well. So that's what we...
I hadn't heard that. I mean, I know the club that he always had a close relationship with was the club in Harrow, because he went to Harrow School. And I think he was their kind of lifetime patron. And I've certainly seen pictures of him with the Harrow Radio Society. I wasn't aware of him coming to Norfolk, but is it possible he may have been staying at Sandringham or something like that and may have come?
Well,
I don't know.
That's a good possibility, of course. And also, Roy G3ZIG says that he worked JY2 because he knew that she came from Ipswich. So we've got some more local connections.
That's a rare contact, because I don't think she came on the air that much. So that's a pretty good one.
Yeah, well, Roy's been on the air a long time as well, so that's really good. So we'll let you carry on with your story now, but just a message again to everybody watching on BATC and Facebook. I believe that the internet or whatever it was that's causing a problem has calmed down a lot now. So if you've got any questions at all for Laurie or anything you'd like to add, then please don't be afraid to put them on there at any time during his talk, and we'll bring them to Laurie. But back to you now, Laurie.
Yeah, okay, so let's carry on here. It's hard to get any sense of who's out there. When I've done these before on Zoom, there's normally been sort of 25 little faces in front of me. But,
yeah, there's about 72 people watching at the moment. So,
okay, so 8 of them have given up, but that's pretty good.
Well, I think that was the internet problem that caused that.
We'll see if we can keep it in the 70s for the next little bit. I'm going to jump you forward now to 1982, and this is the second major story that amateur radio and me was involved in. So 1982, I've now been a journalist for 7 years, and I'm working abroad a fair bit, and I was in Israel making a program about a documentary about kibbutzes, the sort of socialist communal farm settlements that were set up in Israel in the early days. And I'm there at the end of March 1982, March the 31st to be precise. I've been there for a week. I've collected all my material. I'm due to come back on April the 1st, but I've got a free day, staying up in the north of Israel, actually on the place where I had the contact with JY1. I've stayed close to these people over this time. And I'm driving around on the Golan Heights, which was the Israeli-occupied bit of Syria, still remains the Israeli, they've annexed it now, remains the Israeli-occupied bit of Syria. Looking at the sites up there and the military sites, are a very interesting place if you ever get the chance to go there. And I'm listening on the terrible sort of shushy BBC World Service medium wave signal that was available then, to funny stuff going on in the South Atlantic, that a bunch of scrap metal merchants from Argentina have turned up on South Georgia and run up their flag and walking around singing patriotic Argentinian songs. And it's all looking a bit strange, and thinking, interesting, South Georgia, rare country, not really taking too much notice of it. And I come back on April the 1st, and my intention is to go in. I'm due to edit a half-hour program, so I've got a whole pile of old quarter-inch audio tapes to go in, listen to, and eventually put this half-hour program together. And I wake up on the morning of April the 2nd and turn on the radio, and quite clearly there is something fairly major happened, because there are reports that the Falkland Islands have been invaded. Now, the problem here again was we had nothing from the islands, nothing at all. There was no phones, no cell phones. Again, this was 1982, so technology had moved on a bit, although I don't think we had cell phones in 1982, but the internet still hadn't really happened. Obviously, we had electronic communications of a better sort, and we had video and we had satellites and things like that, but it was still at a pretty rudimentary stage compared with what we're used to now. And I'm listening to the radio in the morning about this invasion of the Falkland Islands. So what did we have? We had claims from the Argentinians saying we've invaded, we've done this and that and the other. And although these were widely mocked at the time, it turned out all of these Argentinian claims were absolutely true. We had a rather strange line from the cable and wireless station in Port Stanley saying we have new friends before they disappeared. I think there was a bit of stuff on teletype as well, but basically from about 10 o'clock in the morning our time, from about dawn their time, nothing. I wander into Broadcasting House, I think it was about 10, 11 o'clock, walking into the newsroom with my pile of tapes, to scenes of near panic. People are rushing around, don't know what's going on. A huge story, and a huge political story, because this was the 3rd year of Margaret Thatcher's first term in office. And at that stage, it wasn't going all that well. She was coming under a lot of fire. The economy was in a mess, and her position was seen to be somewhat dangerous, somewhat unstable. So this was looking terrible for her. And a couple of my senior editors grabbed me and said, "Can you get in touch with the Falklands? We don't know what's going on." Now, those of you who've ever been to Broadcasting House, you know where it is, on that sort of kink in Portland Place, just north of Oxford Circus. Still there, the big building, the modern building behind you see at the beginning of all the news programmes, that's gone up relatively recently, but the old famous 1930s Broadcasting House building, which is where the newsroom was then, and a sort of an annex behind, was still there. That was where I was walking into. Over the road was a rather sad, grotty BBC office building called the Langham, which was once a very smart Edwardian hotel, is now again a very smart hotel, or as smart as any hotel is in these lockdown times. Nice place. But at the time it was a BBC office block, a lot of BBC bureaucracy in there and clanky old lifts. It was reputedly one of the most haunted buildings in London. I know one of the newsreaders would tell a story of how the newsreaders used to overnight there between doing a midnight and an early shift, and he said he got physically thrown out of bed one night by some presence that and absolutely swore this was true. So pretty strange, pretty weird place, certainly if you were in there by yourself. On the top was a kind of a garret, and in that garret was G3AYC, which was the Langham radio station, the Langham Amateur Radio Club, which existed in various forms all over the country. There were various club stations in all over the country, some G3 BBC, G2 BBC, but the main one for some reason was G3AYC. And that was in the Langham. And although they were up in this horrible, dusty garret full of old junk and old magazines and bits of old chassis and things like that, there was actually quite a good station up there. There was a Yaesu FT200 transceiver, which was a decent little 100-watt transceiver in those days. There was an FL 2100 linear, so there was some power. And on the roof was a TH3 or TA33, I forget, a 3-element tribander, which was probably 110, 120 feet above the street. It was high. And although in the middle of the West End, it wasn't that noisy, and it worked rather well. And I used to go up there quite often, and you put out a reasonable signal from there. It was pretty good. And they said, "We know you've got this ham radio station over the road. Do you think you can get in touch with the Falklands?" So I said, I'm not sure. I'll go and have a look if you like. And they said, "Yeah, go over there." So I pitch over there about late morning. And I take over a Ewer, which was the small portable recorder we used to use. It was a small German-made recorder, which recorded with 7-inch rolls of 1/4-inch tape. Took one of those over there. The only communications out of there was a dusty old phone, which kind of, hadn't rung for about 30 years. Whenever it rang, dust came sort of flying off it. And I started listening and listening and listening. And I would say again, in 1982, conditions were pretty good. It was just past the peak of that sunspot cycle. 10 meters was good, 15 meters was good. There was lots around. And I'm listening and listening and listening. And then about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I suddenly think, whoa. And there is a voice, and it's a very familiar voice. Now, those of you who worked any of the VP8s, the better known VP8s, there is quite a distinct Falklands accent. It's a kind of almost like a slightly West Country accent, and it's quite distinctive. And I heard this accent, and I kind of recognized the voice as a guy I'd worked once or twice over previous years, Victor Papa 8 Lima Papa, Bob McLeod, who was in Goose Green, and he was being called, he was talking to a few other Gs, he was being called Bob, not using a call sign obviously, but saying what was going on. And I thought, whoa. And I called him and said, "Hi Bob, this is, I was using my own call stroke A actually, it's Laurie G3UML, I'm at the BBC in London. What's going on?" And he said, "Laurie," he said, "I'm going to read this out. This is actually, I'm reading from a piece I wrote for the 30th anniversary for the BBC website." And he came back and he said, Laurie, why is the BBC saying they don't know whether the Falklands has been invaded? This is direct quotes. We have now been taken over. The British government still denies it, but they have no contact, I believe, with the Falklands, and this is probably why they're still denying it. But we have been taken over. There is an aircraft carrier, and I believe 4 other boats. I don't have details on them, but they do have heavy armoured vehicles in Stanley, details I don't know, and quite a number of personnel. They landed approximately 09:30 GMT this morning in landing craft and stormed the capital, Port Stanley, and have taken over the government office. They landed with heavy armoured vehicles. We're now under their control. They are broadcasting that all local people will be treated as normal, fairly peaceful in Stanley at the present time. Well, so I'm a fairly experienced journalist by this time, and I've gone white and I'm shaking because this is British sovereign territory that has been attacked, occupied. This is massive. This is huge. And just at this moment, I and whoever else is listening on 21205 are the only people who know this. So I ring my newsroom and feed some copy down, and we weren't quite as active as we are now. There was no 5 Live, there was no news channel. Obviously, we had the main Radio 4 news and we had the main BBC news, but there was no kind of continuous news going on. I fed this stuff down into the newsroom, and then at 5 o'clock, I fed this stuff down. It must have been about 4 o'clock, 10 past 4, something like that. At 5 o'clock, I was called to get down to go on the beginning of the PM programme, the Radio 4 PM programme, which still runs at 5 o'clock on Radio 4. And they said, Laurie, what's happened? And I sat down there live and I told them this. And to say it caused a sensation is an understatement. It was the confirmation of the story from the centre. Now, you may well ask, since the Argentinians were all over Port Stanley and in control, how was he able to operate and tell me all about it? It's because he was in Goose Green. He was on the other side of East Falkland. I think it's about 50 miles away. The Argentinians had not yet reached there, so they were still liberated. They were still free. The Falklands had a very good 2-metre net. There were a lot of radio hams on the Falklands. Many of them were not, that you didn't need to pass an exam. If you wanted a call sign, you could have a call sign, but virtually everybody had this 2-metre net. And so news moved around very quickly. And so what Bob told me was clearly quite correct. So I go on on Radio 4 at 5 o'clock that evening. I then go back to the radio room over the road to listen a bit further. And this phone goes, kind of rings, and the dust comes off it. And there is someone on there from the Foreign Office, from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Oh, Mr. Margolis, so-and-so here from the Foreign Office, yes. Understand you've been talking to the Falklands. I said, yeah, I have. He said, who have you been talking to? And I said, well, I believe it's this guy in Goose Green. And I'm confident that his information is correct. He's been in VHF radio contact with people much nearer Port Stanley or in Port Stanley. And what does he say? And I went through what I just read to you. And it's right, okay, thank you very much. 6 o'clock, the Foreign Secretary then was Lord Carrington, so he actually stood up in the House of Lords, not the House of Commons, and he announced that the Falklands had been invaded, using very much some of the language that I had used, quoting Bob. David, I think you've got a clip of a live thing I did in 2012.
We have, yes.
Of all this.
Indeed. We're going to play that out now for you.
We are here in the West End, opposite Broadcasting House, and let me explain why we're here. Up behind me is a building which is now the Langham Hotel. It's a very expensive hotel, but at the time, this is April 1982, it was a rather ropey BBC office building, but up on the top where you're looking now, there was an amateur radio station. Now, I am a radio amateur with the call sign G3UML. On the 2nd of April 1982, I'd been on assignment in the Middle East. I came into work and was met with scenes of near panic because the Argentines at 9:30 in the morning, our time, had claimed to have invaded the Falklands, and other than a rather laconic message from Cable and Wireless saying, we have new friends, there was no indication whatsoever from the islands. We had no confirmation, no news, there were no phones, no internet, nothing in those days. I was asked to go and try and use the amateur radio station, which is up on the building there, to contact the Falklands. Went up there and listened around for most of the afternoon. At mid-afternoon, I heard a familiar voice, a fairly distinctive Falkland accent with a sort of West Country burr to it. And I realised this was a guy I'd spoken to a couple of times over the years called Bob McLeod. He was a plumber in Goose Green, about 50 miles outside of Port Stanley. I spoke to him and he said, Laurie, why is the BBC saying there's been no invasion? He said there's an Argentine aircraft carrier in the bay, there are Argentine troops all over town, the governor and the Marines have been taken prisoner. The broadcast station's talking in Spanish, and basically it's all over. We've been invaded by the Argentinians. I then went on Radio 4 on the PM programme. There was no continuous news in those days with this story. Was then rung shortly afterwards by somebody I thought was from the Foreign Office, but I think may have been from an intelligence officer, to ask what I knew. And I told him what I knew, that it was all over. And about 50 minutes later, Lord Carrington stood up as Foreign Secretary in the House of Lords and announced that the invasion had happened. Now, what has really amazed me about these papers, which have come out today, is how crucial that information I gave them was. First of all, to be honest, I'd forgotten how much detail there was there. Thank heavens it was right. And it really was the basis for pretty much everything they knew in those first hours. It was the only intelligence, it was the only hard information. The chap I was speaking to, Bob McLeod, was not in Port Stanley, he was 50 miles away, but they had a very good VHF link up around the islands, and his information was good. As it turned out, it was spot on. And that is how the day developed.
I think that was
Okay.
a sudden end, but there we are.
Yeah, well, that was part of a longer thing I did in 2012. So what provoked that? As I say, rather like the JY1 story, this is one that follows me around. 2012, so we're 30 years on from this. I think some of you may know that they release usually after 30 years, cabinet papers relating to the time, which often give us a very great insight into what actually went on. So some of them are 30 years afterwards, some of them more sensitive 70 years afterwards, some of them probably never. I believe the ones relating to the abdication of Edward VIII in 1936 will never be released. But they released the Falklands papers in December 2012. And so between Christmas and New Year, I was at home, and the phone goes on, I think the 27th, and it's a friend who's one of our reporters, who said, Laurie, he says, I'm just looking through the Falklands papers. He said, you're all over them. I said, right. I said, that's interesting. What did I say? So he sent me this. It's a slightly fading fax now. You won't be able to read it probably off the screen there, but this is from one of the cabinet papers that was released in 1982. I always quite like it. I'll read some of it. It's confidential on the top and copied into all sorts of people with all sorts of strange initials. But it says, I have spoken to an amateur radio ham at the BBC by the name of Margolis, put me in my place, who's been in touch with an amateur radio operator situated some 50 miles away from Port Stanley. According to Mr. Margolis, the Argentines attacked at 09:35 in overwhelming force. Only Port Stanley was attacked. Some 500 Argentines landed. It's thought another 1,500 remained on board ships, an aircraft carrier and 4 or 5 other vehicles. A ceasefire was arranged and the governor and his personnel taken into custody. And then there's more stuff there, not from me, but they obviously discovered themselves. The Argentines are making arrangements to fly them back to the UK. 3 Argentines were hurt in the shooting. There were no casualties amongst the Marines, although this changed later on. Mr. Margolis had last contacted his correspondent at 4 p.m. BST when he said all was quiet in Port Stanley. A tape recording was given to the radio newsroom, and I presume that excerpts from it will be broadcast tonight. Well, you bet your life they will be. Then there's another thing afterwards. I spoke to Mr. Margolis at 17:10 BST. In other words, this was just after I'd been on the PM programme, who confirmed the situation was still quiet, added the following clarification. The Marines had been included in the personnel taken into custody with the governor. No information about any injuries. A little more detail there, confidential, copied to various people. So one thing that pleased me about this 30 years on was at least I had been right, because I kind of went through the years thinking, oh my God, this is never going to be right. On the day it happened, I should say, we got through the 5 o'clock and the 6 o'clock news. Just before 7 o'clock, my news editor over in Broadcasting House rang me up said, Laurie, can you come down to my office right away? And I thought, oh my God, I got this completely wrong. Never happened, completely wrong, nonsense. I walk into his office and he's only called a press conference. Now, I'm quite used to press conferences, but normally being with the pack on the other side, not being the subject of them. But there I was in front of Fleet Street's finest, being grilled about who I'd spoken to and what I'd heard and what it was all about. So it was quite a day. So that is the Falkland story. And again, making the point, this was a major international story that emerged and was confirmed only through amateur radio, through no other source. And it wasn't until, if you remember, it was a long time before we got any independent reporting from the Falklands, because the journalists went down with the task force. They were heavily controlled by the MOD. You'll remember Brian Hanrahan's famous phrase as he watched planes taking off from an aircraft carrier: "I can't tell you how many planes there are, but I can tell you this: I counted them all out and I counted them all back again." So it was a long time before we had any direct reporting from the islands, and it was eventually June before the military, the British military, went down there, the task force, and against all the odds managed to win. Now, my contacts with Bob went on for about 3 or 4 days, and then it became increasingly dangerous as the Argentinians were getting closer and closer to Goose Green. I was always slightly concerned about sticking him on the air. We never identified him, but it wouldn't have taken a genius down there, I don't think, to work out who he was. I was concerned about his security, and also as British troops were, that they were some distance from landing then, but also later on with the security of British troops who'd arrived. There were contacts, so my contacts sort of tailed off after about 4 or 5 days, and I didn't pursue them. There were contacts that carried on with amateur radio stations in the UK for quite a long time. Very clandestine stuff. The full story, I think, is still to be told. I've heard all sorts of versions of it, and really interesting the way it went. That some of these stations, there was one on West Falkland, which was a different island completely, far less heavily populated. Not that East Falkland was that heavily populated, and he carried on for some time more. So amateur radio played a really major part in that. Mostly on 15 meters. We had deliberate QRM from Argentinians going, calling us pirates, shouting Malvinas Argentinas. It all added to the fun. So that is the Falklands VP8 story, which is another part of my backstory. I've 3 times been, and this is unusual for a journalist. I'm a working journalist. I'm not normally the center of stories. I normally cover stories. I have 3 times been the center of a story. The first time was in 1970, King Hussein, when I was a student. Second time was 1982, when I was fairly central to the coverage of the story. And the third time was in 2001. Actually, the 20th anniversary of that is coming up, when an IRA splinter group blew up Television Centre, taking my car with it. And I'd managed to get into a position where we filmed it. So if you Google me, plus, I think, something like Television Centre Blast, you will see a fairly amazing shot of the bomb going off that blew out the front of Television Centre. That had absolutely nothing to do with amateur radio, but it was another time I became centre of the story. That kind of ends what you might call the media side of this. I was going to go on to much more prosaic amateur radio stuff. Does anybody want to ask anything or say anything about what I've done so far?
That's a very good point, Laurie. So we've had a couple of people come back on the earlier piece about JY1, with a couple of people who are sadly no longer with us now. Pat G3IOR had a QSO with JY1 in the 70s, and somebody else, Paul, said that Bill Higgins, who's a long term ago, chairman of the club, G3PNR, claims he also worked JY1 many years ago. But if you're watching this now, we don't have any other questions or comments at the moment. I think it's probably because they're all enthralled and watching you and listening to your stories. They are extraordinary. But anyway, if you have got anything for Laurie, please send them soon, either on Facebook or on BATC. One thing I was going to ask, Laurie, I mean, this seems extraordinary, really, that the technology in a fairly basic sort of amateur radio, it was greater than anything maybe that the forces had at the time in the Falklands.
The forces weren't there. You
Right.
see, but there was only a very small detachment of Marines in the Falklands. I mean, they would have had communications, but I think they were knocked out fairly quickly.
Right.
And there wasn't much there. There's a lot of stuff down there now. There's an airport, and there's vessels and military and the RAF and all the rest of it. But at the time, there was very little there, and very basic sort of telephone link down there, and that was it.
Extraordinary, I suppose, as you say. Now you'd have everything, you'd have the internet, so you can communicate fully. But in those days, then amateur radio was it was unique to this story, wasn't it? Really?
Yeah. quite a lot of people have said to me, could the same happen again with either of these stories? Well, yes, I suppose it could, but it would require all the modern communications to be knocked out. In other words, internet, cell phones, everything. And these systems everywhere in the world, in fact, almost more in developing countries than here, are very resilient and quite modern systems. And while, I'm sure somewhere like China could shut itself off, even there, you still get dissenting voices coming out. And it would be very, very hard to shut somewhere down completely.
Even then, you've got satellites, I guess, as well. So even if the ground's infrastructure
there were communication satellites certainly by then. I mean, we were our people who went down there were able to satellite stuff back from the British warships. So they were there by 1982, but not for only huge dishes and with major sort of ground stations, not in the much simpler way that we do now. In
both the JY1 and the Falklands, you were based in the UK doing these, and that's what got the media interest. But when you were doing, I presume, more travelling as a BBC reporter in the earlier days, did you have a portable radio station, amateur radio station that you took with you?
No, I really didn't. I wasn't. We were travelling with enough clobber anyway in those days, and I always found I kind of needed to concentrate on what I was doing rather than playing amateur radio. But some of the technical people did. There's a guy I used to know slightly. In fact, he died fairly recently, Keith G3KOX, who was a very keen 6-meter man. And he worked for ABC, for the American ABC network, and they travel with tons of stuff. And he always used to take a bit of amateur radio gear with him, and he often used to. The nature of their job was they'd kind of establish a base and then be there for a while. So they weren't kind of moving around. But no, I have to say, the only time I did amateur radio on a major story, I did the invasion of Grenada in 1983. I went there and was on Grenada for several weeks. And there was a couple of radio hams on Grenada who I knew. And although they shut down initially, they came back on the air. And I did actually link up with one of them and had a great afternoon operating my call J37/G3UML from his station in Grenada. But that was just kind of alongside what I was doing. It wasn't part of it.
Okay, thank you. Well, as I said to everybody at home now, this is the time to, if you've got any questions or anything for Laurie, remember he's also a senior news editor in the BBC. So if you've got any questions for him in his current job, I'm sure he's also happy to answer any questions on them. But back to you, Laurie.
I'll tell you what I'll do in the meantime. Now we're going to have a dramatic change of gear and we're going to go on to amateur radio and DX and that sort of thing. So as I said before, my journey has been rather backwards because I started off with an extremely good station with a big antenna on a big tower and with extremely good equipment. So as life went on, 1978, I got married, moved over to Northwest London and into the house where we have stayed ever since in 1979. And I'd been here, so where we are is just north of the North Circular, quite near the bottom of the M1, fairly small semi-detached house, which we bolted extra bits onto, a fairly small garden with a large oak tree, a 300-year-old oak tree in it, which is probably about 60 feet high altogether, but has a big overhanging bough at 38 feet, which I've made good use of. Mm-hmm. And at the back of my location, I actually have a park, so on the half of the compass that goes from south round to west up to north, I have a reasonably good takeoff. So it's not a bad location. So when we've been living here about a year, I thought it's time I tried to get back on the air. So had all of my gear was in storage at my grandmother's house in Ilford, where we used to live. Brought it all over. It was the SB 303, the 401, the 200. So nice station. And I stuck up a dipole for 15 meters at probably about 10 feet above the ground. You could almost touch it. And the conditions were good. We're talking 1980, again, at the peak of the sunspot cycle. There was plenty around. And I switched it all on and called CQ and worked one or two people and thought, this seems to be working quite well. This location looks promising. And I remember then there used to be a DX net on 15 meters run by a German guy and was listening there. And he used to get some quite interesting stuff on. And he had a station in Tonga, A35 Tonga. And I could hear him. He wasn't very strong, about 5 and 2, but I could hear him. I could copy him quite well. And I thought, I wonder, broke into this net, eventually got called. I said, I'll try A35, whoever it was, called him. Back comes A35. You're, I think, 5 and 1, but perfectly readable. I gave him 5 and 2, said thank you very much, and thought, wow, I've just worked Tonga with an antenna 10 feet above the ground. This seems to be quite promising. So I kind of resolved fairly early on that towers and things were out of the question, because the garden is quite small. It's dominated by this big oak tree. There's a big horse chestnut just over the fence in the park. So there isn't kind of much sky space. It would have been very hard to get antennas up and down through the trees, and backing onto a public park, I'm not quite sure how long it would have lasted. So I thought, I'll see how I do with wire antennas. So I gradually put up more and more dipoles and wires and got them a bit higher. So most of them are now at about 35, 38 feet. I changed things around, but what I've got at the moment, there's 5 antennas up there. There is a tri-band dipole for 10, 15 and 20. This is made by a firm called Alpha Delta. It's something you can make yourself, but this one's, it's particularly well made and very good quality sort of hardware. Works on 10, 15 and 20 as a halfway dipole on the same feed line. I've got that. I have a similar thing made by a firm who advertise quite widely now called EA Antennas, made in Spain, for the walk bands. So for 30, 17 and 12, and it actually works on 6 as well, which is almost parallel, slightly further away, also at about 35 feet. I have a 40-meter delta loop, which is a great antenna. This is a full wavelength 40-meter delta, which I feed in the bottom corner. The apex is at about 38 feet again, about as high as I can get. It is not, it should be an equilateral triangle. It's not, it's a very flat, wonky triangle, but it works really well. It tunes on 40, it works on 20, it works on 15, it even works on 160. And it's been a great antenna. I've worked something like 320 countries on 40 meters with this. I have an inverted L for 80 meters, so that is a quarter wave, goes up for 30 odd feet and then comes off at an angle, fed at the bottom against a couple of radials. In the middle of winter, I roll out a few more radials, so it works a bit better. Again, a very simple antenna, but it's properly resonant. It works quite well. And I don't beat the guys with the 4 squares and the huge, very high dipoles, but I do reasonably well on 80 to the extent of about 280 countries now. In addition to that, I have a vertical dipole for 10 and 12, which I like because it gives me a bit better coverage into the States. So the horizontal dipole I've got runs roughly east to west, so favours north and south, not very good off the end, but this other one on 10 and 12 when they're open gives me a better signal to the west. So I've got everything covered. I have got the 5 antennas. They are all carefully tuned. They all work reasonably well. The station I've got, let me attempt to show you. I don't know if this is going to work, but very, very simple. But is that in shot, Dave?
Yes, it is. Yeah. If you just lift it up a tiny bit, actually. I think like that looks like Yaesu, FTX.
Very, very simple station, everybody. It's Yaesu FTDX 101D, which I bought in the summer. There is an Expert 1.5 amplifier. There is a very old Heathkit monitor scope, which I use.
Oh, I love the look of that, Laurie.
Yeah, well, I've actually got another one here that doesn't work, but it's can't be far short of 50 years old. Works perfectly, and is just so useful for assuring you that your signal is as it should be.
Yes.
So all of this is fairly new. Up to the beginning of last year, I had an FT2000, wonderful transceiver. I had an Expert 1K, and I'd run that station for about 10 years. But I don't know, I think a lot of people thought over lockdown, I'm spending a lot of time sitting in front of this gear, why don't we try and improve it a bit? So I swapped the FT2000 for this 101, which I absolutely love. I swapped the 1K for the 1.5, which is actually lighter and more easily maneuverable. Very, very small, desktop, runs stone cold, works beautifully. And the whole thing is a very simple, fairly high-tech station, which I'm thoroughly enjoying using, and I'm on the air quite a lot. So what I would say, the point I'm making here is that I started off with very good antennas, was normally at the top of every pile-up with a beam at 60 feet in the late 60s. You were one of the leading stations in the country and pretty good across Europe. Obviously, with what I've got now, I'm way down the list and below all you people with big beams and cubical quads and things like that. So you need a little bit of know-how and sense to be working DX well. And the targets I set myself, I want to be a serious DXer. I don't want to be sort of thinking, oh, I couldn't get that one or I missed this one. If something is there, I want to be able to work it. So the first thing you need is power. You're not going to do this without power. You need the maximum power that you can have, that you're allowed. At least you need everything you can get inside if you are limited outside. The second, that even if they are simple antennas, they need to be properly tuned, they need to work properly. Simpler the better. I used to use various things with traps, but I tend to avoid traps now because they collapse over periods, they're not very reliable, and they've kind of gone out of favour generally, although the big ones on antennas like high gain beams are okay, but some of the smaller ones are pretty are not very good. And you need a certain amount of street smarts and common sense to work your way around. Now, I have worked with these antennas, so we're talking about wire antennas under 38 feet high. I have worked every country. I mean every country. I think it's either 339 or 340 at the moment. Got them all. And I've got, with the various deletions, I've actually got about 375, which puts me, I think I'm the second phone station in the United Kingdom and about fifth overall. So I'm pretty near the top. Now, part of the reason for that is I've been around a long time. There's one way of working lots of DX, and that's be around a long time to work it. It's a long game, this. You sometimes have to wait years for countries to come up. But there needs to be a bit more about it. So I'll just tell you a couple of stories about how I have sometimes managed to work difficult DX using simple antennas when it would be far more difficult. Mm. Back in the 80s, China was very rare. It's fairly easy to work China now, but back in the 80s, China was very rare. And it began to come on with a station with the China Radio Club in Beijing, BY1PK. It was the only station on from China. And one of the guys who got it going was a Chinese Canadian who lived in Vancouver, who still had good connection with China, went back and forth, managed to get them to establish the station properly and start training operators. And BY1PK was on the air. It was only on CW. And I should say 99% of what I do is on sideband. I use CW only for pile-ups and for rare countries on the low bands. And that's what I do. I don't use digital modes at all, not interested. But so I'm 99% sideband and 1 or 2% CW. BY1PK was actually only on CW. But I thought, well, I'd quite like to work this one. At the time, I probably only needed about 5 or 10 countries, and China was one of them. So I wrote them a letter. It was over, I think it was kind of the winter of 1980 or 81, around Christmas time. I wrote to them, dear friends, radio amateur in the United Kingdom, using very simple antennas, and would very much like to be able to work you. I wonder if you consider having a sked. And I suggested about 4 skeds on 20 meters early in the morning. Never knew if the letter got there. First sked came, conditions weren't very good. Second sked came, nothing there. They were always at 8 o'clock in the morning, where the band was open, allegedly open at that time. Third sked, nothing. Thought, oh, they never got the letter, or they're not going to do it, forget about it. Fourth one, I actually didn't bother to get up. I actually slept in. And about 8:30, 9 o'clock, the phone goes, and it's a friend in Sweden, an SM6. He said, Laurie, are you aware that BY1PK has been calling you solidly for the last half hour? That there are thousands of stations calling him, but he just keeps calling you. I wasn't actually. Let me try and come on. So I kind of fly downstairs, turn the rig on. There's, headphones flying in one direction, dust off the Morse key, which isn't used much. And lo and behold, there is BY1PK calling me with very slow CW. I go back to him. We have a QSO at about 8 words a minute. And there is my BY1PK QSO. Card turns up soon after. Managed to make an SSB contact. I can't honestly remember if it was with them or somebody else, but got China. Nice. We're pleased about that. Let us go forward to, I think it was about the turn of the millennium, maybe the late 90s. North Korea. North Korea, for those of you who are not DXers, is the kind of holy grail. It's the one that is rarely been on, is very unlikely to come on. It's really, really difficult, and it's not been on the air now for, I think, the best part of 18 or 20 years. All of a sudden, we start getting news that a station is on from Pyongyang, North Korea. What's his call sign? It's P5/4L4FN. 4L4 is a call sign from Georgia, not the American Georgia, but the Tbilisi Georgia, the one that used to be in the Soviet Union. And a guy from Georgia seems to have managed to get a license in Pyongyang, and he is on the air. And for reasons I never quite worked out, he seems to be backed by the AMSAT, the satellite organization in Texas. Why he got tied up with the satellite organization in Texas, I don't know, but they seem to manage to get gear to him. And he is on the air. And I'm looking, of course, when he's coming on, he's getting absolutely obliterated by callers. P5 had only been on very briefly a few years earlier. OH2BH managed to get on from there, made a few QSOs, mostly with Japan, a few with the States, very, very few with Europe, a few OHs, I think a couple of EAs, no Gs, no Fs, no DLs, no nothing. So effectively, no one had ever worked North Korea, but it was a separate country. And ever since that operation, it counted as a new one because it had been legally activated. So I sort of thought about this and discovered that 4L4FM, his name was Edisha Georgiadze, he was from Georgia, worked for the World Food Programme, WFP. And I thought about this a bit and looked at the WFP website. This was 2000, so the internet was up and running by then. And realised that everybody on the WFP website had an address at wfp.org. So I thought, I wonder. And I wrote an email to Edisha Georgiadze at wfp.org and said, hi, Eddie, I hope this reaches you. I'm a radio ham in London. And I said, it's, very excited to see you're on the air. Quite difficult for us in the UK because we're right behind the whole of Europe to work to the Far East. We've got a credible number of stations in Europe who are better positioned than we are. And I'm using fairly modest antennas here. I said, you are the last country I need. I said, would it be possible to try and organise a sked with you? If it's not, ignore this, but if it is, maybe we can try and fix something up. And at the time, he'd only been on 10 metres, but 10 metres was wide open at the time. Again, at the peak of another sunspot cycle around the turn of the millennium, conditions were very good. So I send this email off. I get a reply in 5 minutes. Hi, Laurie. Really pleased to hear with you. Yes, be very happy to have a sked with you. Be interesting. Haven't worked G yet. Where would you like to meet? So I gave this some thought. I thought, well, let's get him well away from the QRM, shall we? So I said, let's try it, I think tomorrow morning, Eddie. Conditions seem to be quite good about 8 o'clock in the morning. Let's go up to about 28,780. Well away from anybody else. It's fine. Come down the next morning, boom, 28,780, G3UML P5/4L4FN. Well, we have a proper QSO. Rig, weather, what are you doing, the name is, all the rest of it. We have a proper QSO. And I said, listen, this is fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. And sign off. And I'm sitting there thinking, I am the only person, not only in G, but mostly in Europe, who's ever worked North Korea. Nobody else has worked it. I've got this one to myself. And half of me thought, well, this is quite nice. I'm the only one who's worked it. The other one thought, well, I've got an in with this guy. Maybe it'd be nice to try and set something else up. So I went back to him and said, Eddie, that was fantastic. I'm really grateful. Look, it won't come as a surprise to you to know that many other Gs would like to try and work you. Would you be prepared to have a sked next week? Came back, certainly, draw up a list. He said, not too many stations. He said, draw up a list, I'll work through them. So I got in contact with various DX-minded friends at that time. Only one ever refused. Any DXers amongst you may remember Steve Cole, GW4BLE, great operator in South Wales, good friend, very good contest operator. He'd worked everything. And Steve said, I don't need anybody to help with my DX. I work it by myself. Fine, respected him. And of course, he managed to work it. But there were about 14 or 15 others, most of the top GDXers. Sent this list to Eddie. He comes up the next Sunday, boom, 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 works through the lot of them. Fantastic. Agrees to do the same the following week. And it's already, word is kind of starting to leak out. I'm getting the odd email from Holland and one or two from Italy, understand you, can we join in? And I put another list of people over. And then got a nice email from Eddie saying, look, Laurie, said, been really happy to do this, but I'm starting to get a lot of flack from a lot of criticism from the rest of Europe about why I seem to be working strings of Gs and nothing else. So I think we better leave it now. So I said, listen, mate, fantastic, really grateful. we got quite a number of stations over. And he at the time he was using just a barefoot transceiver and a vertical. He got sent a linear. He managed to put a beam up, and he had a really big signal. And he used to come on. I worked him once by conventional methods on 15. He used to come up on about 21,225 in the late morning hour time. Enormous signal, huge signal. And with pile-ups like I don't think even since I've ever heard. I mean, you can just imagine an enormous signal from North Korea on 15-meter sideband. He only operated on sideband at the time on 10 and 15. He did a little bit of RTTY. I know one or two people claim CW QSOs. I've never understood how they made them because, to the best of my knowledge, he never made me CW QSOs, but maybe he did, I don't know. Move on again, and all of these stories you will see all have kind of tales that follow you around. Some years later, and again, I guess it was about the turn of the millennium, I am in the far southeast of Turkey. And again, it's a thing connected with Saddam Hussein and Iraq. I was on the Iraqi border because it had kicked off again. It was Gulf War II, I think the one where the Americans finally ended up going into Baghdad. And they were worried about the consequences in Turkey. The Turkish were very heavily armed. They were worried the Iraqis were going to come across into Turkey. And they were, we were down there because we thought there may be a story. So way down in the far southeast of Turkey. And I was in some grotty hotel we were staying, and there were a bunch of people there from the WFP, from the World Food Programme. And started talking to them and said, look, there's only one person I know from the WFP. I said he used to work in Pyongyang, a guy from Georgia called Eddie Georgiadze. They said, oh, Eddie, we know him very well. He's working in Ankara at the moment, in Turkey. So I said, you don't have a number for him, do you? They said, yes, they found me his Ankara cell phone number. So I was in Turkey as well. So I ring him, and the phone answers, familiar voice. I said, P5-4L4FN. I think I may have said TA-4L4FN. This is G3UML. And there was silence. He said, where are you? What's this all about? And I said, I'm in Turkey. I said, I'm going to be in Ankara in 2 or 3 days. I said, let's meet up. So we did. We went out for a lovely Italian meal, had a great chat, charming guy, who went on to work in Angola, and I've lost track with him now. But I said, come on. I said, how did you do it? I said, well, how did you manage it? He said, I got permission from a very high army general. He said, early on, I made contact with a very high general in the North Korean army. And he came in, brought other people in, gave me the official okay to operate, some sort of license. And he said it went on for just over a year. He actually made 17,000 contacts.
Wow.
In the course of a year. He made a lot of contacts. And most people who set their minds to work in probably would have done. He was quite a good operator. He used to come on for a couple of hours every day. Since then, I should say, there was one very strange operation from a Polish guy a couple of years ago. I think only made 4 European contacts. Very, very odd. I've never seen real photographic or video evidence. I've seen pictures of a rig in a room, but nothing further. And they were always talking about going back. I don't think it's ever gotten anywhere. So North Korea remains, there's now 20 years worth of new amateurs who come through who want to work it. North Korea remains extremely rare. So I have never, as a low-powered, well, not low-powered, but a low-powered in terms of the antenna station, I use every legitimate trick in the book. And if it's a question now of texting somebody or ringing somebody or writing to somebody, I will do it as long, obviously, as I make the contact. The contact you make has got to be a proper amateur radio contact. Of course it does. But it's kind of worked out that way. So as I say, using these very simple antennas, I've worked every DXCC country, all 340. I've done 5-band worked all zones, which is all 40 WAZ zones, worked across 5 bands, including 80 meters. Another story about that in a second. I've done 5-band WAS, which is the worked all states one again. A few of those were from my previous incarnation in Ilford, but the majority of those were from this location. And those are the kind of 3, the honor roll, 5-band WAS, 5-band WAZ, as far as I'm concerned, are the 3 core major awards, which say you're a serious player. 5-band WAZ is a hard one, really hard one. And it's one I recommend you chase if you have the ability to do it. There's not that many, I think there's only about a dozen Gs have done it. And that is the one where you have to work each of the 40 CQ zones across 5 bands. So obviously 10 meters is a problem when conditions are not good. 40 meters is a problem, and 80 meters is a big problem. And the really big one on 80 meters is zone 31. Now, I did work zone 31. I worked C21 Nauru for 5-band WAZ. But when I was doing 5-band WAS, I needed Hawaii as a state. And I thought, it just seemed really difficult. I worked a bit on the West Coast, and I'd worked one or two of the difficult states. I worked Nevada and Wyoming, but Hawaii on 80 meters just always seemed just a bridge too far, a cut above. So I started researching who were the big stations there, and a couple of them had worked. There was, unfortunately, the 1 year between when I left Ilford and set up here, there was one big station on from Hawaii who had a beam on 80 meters, who I subsequently became very friendly with. But the year he was really busy on 80 meters, I was not on the air, so I missed him when quite a few people worked him. And I wrote to a couple of the KH6s and tried to make skeds with them. And it was very interesting because one in particular, KH6ND, had very good signal. And I wrote to him, and it was in the early days of email. We already had email. And we made this sked for it. It would have been dawn sometime in the middle of the winter. And I go on and I call him, and there's like an S6 noise, and I can't hear anything. And suddenly I'm getting emails. He said, "Why aren't you coming back to me?" I said, "I can't hear you, Mike." He said, "You're a really good signal here. I don't understand why you can't hear me." And I'm switching to other antennas. I said, "Mike, I cannot hear a sound." I said, "I've got S6 noise here." And he really got quite annoyed. He just couldn't comprehend why he was hearing me and I couldn't hear him, but I couldn't. Anyway, I then pushed this a bit further and realized there was another guy who is still around. We're called K9FD/KH6, who is on one of the smaller islands on Molokai, not the big island or Oahu. And K9FD was very good on top band. He was working Europe on top band. I kept seeing reports. So I thought, well, if he's on top band, he must be quite good on 80 as well. So dropped him an email, said, see you're on top band, really love to try you on 80, would you mind? And he said, no, let's do it. And it was very early in the year. It was the 1st of October, much earlier than I would have thought. And I remember it was 10 to 6 in the morning, and came on the frequency on CW. And lo and behold, there was K9FD/KH6 with a perfectly readable signal, called him, had a decent QSO, and that was my 80 meter contact for Hawaii. And he's around. I've seen him spotted on 160. I think he may be using FT8 now, and FT8 has kind of in many ways changed the whole rules. I mean, it's I think FT8 contacts are perfectly valid, but to me it's about as exciting as watching a WhatsApp message go through. I just don't get it.
So you don't do it? You don't do FT8 and any of these new modes?
No. I may have to one day, but no, I don't do it. And I look at other people, lines of code going through, and I just think, what the heck? It just means nothing at all. So no, I don't. So that's kind of where I am at the moment. Fairly new equipment, on the air a lot. Been doing this now for 1965 to now, so is it 55 years this year? If the good Lord and COVID leave me in one piece, hopefully I'll do it for a few more years. I still enjoy it, still love it, and it's a great hobby. So I think that's probably all I've got, David. I've been going on for a long time. I don't know how many of those 72 people are still there, but
you've done really well to not even. I haven't even seen you take a sip of drink, so I don't know how you've done that. I couldn't do that. I've got a big glass of squash just off. All right, just off screen. A couple of things, if I could. Being a long time ago, an ex-BBC person myself, and they had a great station, as you said there, and now they've got G8 BBC. So do you ever use that radio station?
I do. It's interesting because G8 BBC is nothing to do with the old aerial radio group. There was this official group which was part of the BBC club, and they put in stations all over the place, but they were pretty much defunct. So when the Langham building was sold, we lost the location for G3AYC, and the Langham building was redeveloped as a luxury hotel again, which it is now. We lost the location for G3AYC on top of the building there, which was unfortunate. It was re-established at Television Centre. Now, any of you who've been past Television Centre, it's all been tarted up now, and it's Soho House and a hotel and shops and everything. But the basic circular building is still there.
The donut.
Just beyond the circular building is a rather dreary-looking 60s sort of skyscraper called the East Tower. and they got a room in the top of that. But I only went up there once or twice. I could never get out on the roof to play with the antennas. It was always quite difficult to get out there.
That was the news block, wasn't it, mainly?
It was it was engineering and all that sort of thing, and it just never seemed to work very well. I tried to go on once or twice and just found nothing ever seemed to work very well. So that went defunct. Anyway, a whole new group of people got involved, and notably Jim Lee, G4AEH, who's the Radio 4 newsreader, who's very keen. A guy called Martin Kempster, M5AEO, who's actually left us now and does a lot of work for the Imperial War Museum, but he got it going. And amazingly, when we all moved into Broadcasting House, so they shut Television Centre, they shut Bush House, the whole news operation was concentrated in the big new building behind Broadcasting House. They got a space in, it's what it used to be known as, I think, the cottage. It was where Arthur Askey always used to refer to the BBC cottage during the war. And it's kind of on the 8th floor of the old part of Broadcasting House. So if you look at it from street level, it's kind of, you look sort of up above the old entrance, it's kind of up there. And it's a funny old space. It's almost like a big cupboard. It's got metal sides, and you climb into it from a conference room, which is mostly used for Radio 1. So all these Radio 1 trendies are sort of in there, and they look at you going through this door into this strange metal room. But it was officially opened about a year or so ago by Lord Hall, the Director General, who made a couple of QSOs from there, which he was very, very excited about. They've got a TS590 up there, nice transceiver. They've got a Yaesu VHF rig. They've got a couple of dipole antennas. You can't really see from the ground, but there's I think a 40-meter dipole up there, something on 20. It works reasonably well. It's a little bit noisy, but they are on from there, G8 BBC, and there's other call signs as well. This new group is very enthusiastic. I've not been particularly involved with it myself, but it's great that they're still active from there and have had the nous to get the thing going again. And I'm going to try and operate from there a bit more often. It's really great that they're still active. From there.
When things get back to normal, then you're back in the office. Then you'll be able to sneak off there, I'm sure.
Yeah. I've got a feeling Jim Lee was actually there. I think he was there yesterday or the day before, operating on 40 meters from GA BBC.
Yeah, I met Jim Lee virtually, as it were, because we were both involved with the RSGB online convention this year or last year. And he was hosting one stream, and I was hosting the other. So I'll have to try and catch a look in there one day.
He's a very, very nice guy.
He is, yeah.
And his partner, his lady friend, is Kathy Cluxton, who's another Radio 4 newsreader. So these two quite famous voices, actually. Yeah,
got incestuous business, but they're lovely. A couple of other just quick comments coming into you now. Lots of people saying thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. I know we've had some internet challenges for everybody at home. I think there's been some vision challenges occasionally, but luckily a lot of this is obviously what you're saying, so they've been able to hear it. We've got Keith Martin said, I work JY1. The card is framed proudly on the shack wall. We've got Paul said, a NARC once went to the BBC studios to watch the recording of Only Fools and Horses, so that would have been the old television centre, wouldn't it, I think?
I don't know where they actually recorded it.
I guess the inside shots, at least.
It must have been done at Television Centre, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of location stuff.
The famous Reliant Robin, just sitting in the car park for ages.
Oh, really?
It must be worth a fortune, that thing.
Last time I went to Television Centre, before they closed it all, there was still a TARDIS outside. I remember that.
Yeah.
That was good to see. Donard says that probably the most exciting talk that I've ever witnessed. Absolutely wonderful. Many thanks, Laurie, for sharing. There we go. So
it's a great
lots of people. Mike M0TVG says, thanks, Laurie. Very interesting story. I worked Bob VP8LIZ on 12 metres SSB in 2013. Signals received 5 and 9. His report 3 and 5. That was just using 100 watts on an R8 vertical antenna. That was Mike M0TVG.
Who BP8LIZ is. That must have been a special call he was using. Bob is still very active, very active. He's in Port Stanley now. This is actually, I meant to show this. This is a QSL card from the time.
Oh, yes,
this one actually seems to be dated July 1982. So this is not the original contacts we had in April. This was clearly one we had afterwards. So his His wife is Janet, VP8AIB, who certainly used to work for Vodafone down there. I'm not sure if she still does. Bob has a big signal, is on all the time, heck of a nice guy. And, he's got a very good, I think he's got a 60-foot tower down there in power. And he is easy to work if, it's always a good path down there. He is easy to work if someone needs the Falklands.
That's wonderful. I can't tell you, it's been, excuse me, very static really on questions and things, but now everybody's coming in just saying how wonderful it really has been. And I'm not just kidding this. Laurie, you can check the Facebook page yourself. You'll see the sort of comments that people are making. So they've just been, in awe of really what you're saying. So it's a wonderful story that you've said. I think before you go, if I may, just one question, because your job, apart from your love of amateur radio, you're very senior in BBC News. So can I just ask you for a few moments, just what the last year has been like, and has that been one of your most extraordinary years in all of your years of broadcasting?
Yeah, I mean, this is the biggest story. Well, it's certainly the biggest story since 9/11, and you can argue that it's been the biggest story, well, maybe the Vietnam War in its totality or the Korean War, but you can argue it's one of the biggest stories ever in terms of the effect on people, in terms of its worldwide spread. I mean, I think there's only about 6 countries that haven't got COVID. They're all Pacific Islands, but they're all affected because they don't let anybody in. So places like Palau and I think the Marshall Islands and out there, they haven't got it, but they're still cut off because they dare not let anybody in. It has been difficult in many ways for us. I mean, obviously, we've been working from home. This is not just us. This is other broadcast organisations. We use far more online video. So you will have seen time and time again, the majority of the video we use now in terms of interviews with people is done online. The old days when we would have gone to someone's house to interview them, unless it requires an extensive bit of filming off the side, we just don't do this anymore. To go inside someone's house to be able to interview them, you need to have social distancing. You need, I would almost go so far as to say you need PPE, perhaps not that, but you certainly need masks. And it doesn't work. So if we do go to interview people, we tend to do it outside, which is much safer. But we do masses and masses of online stuff. And this is going to change news gathering coverage forever, because one thing that amazes me is how good the quality of some of the online pictures are. You look sometimes at an interviewee and you think, well, that surely can't be coming down the internet on Zoom or something, or Facebook. It's got to be an outside broadcast unit there, but it's not. Some of the quality you get now with good quality broadband and decent phones and computers is remarkably good, and this has changed things completely.
Yeah, that's what I was going to. You've just taken the words out of my mouth, really, Laurie. I was going to ask you. Now that we have got used to this online world, and we've got used to occasionally staggered but quite acceptable Zoom connections with people working from home, even ministers and people like that, important people just still working from home. Do you think it really has changed news gathering forever? And even though there will be a time when we can all get back and we can meet people one-to-one, that the news for you is going to change?
Yes, I don't know if the news is going to change, but the way we gather it is going to change. We, for argument's sake, if we go out to do something as simple as a vox pop, that little device where you get 4 or 5 voices, which people, I always rather like it, actually. I think it gives a story a bit of life and a bit of connection. Well, you can't just walk up to somebody with a microphone anymore. You can't do that. So you have to kind of go, you'll have seen these mics on long poles all the time. You've got to stay at least more than 6 feet back. Obviously, the camera works okay over that distance, but you can't just jump on people. You've got to say to people, are you okay with us talking to you? And they, yes, right, you stay there. I'll go back here. So it is going to change. We're not going to suddenly, having had a year of perfectly good online content in terms of voices, in terms of talking heads like my one, we're not going to suddenly say, right, we'll forget all that, back to, we're not going to put anything on the air unless we send a £250,000 satellite truck there and do it like that. Of course, we will need proper outside broadcast and news gathering equipment, and one assumes we will get back to something like normal when the world gets back to something like normal, but I don't think that's going to be before the end of this year.
No. And news gathering, as you say, has probably changed and has probably made it more accessible for you as a news person yourself.
Yeah.
Well, look, Laurie, thank you ever so much for sharing that. Thank you, by the way, for all the work that you and your colleagues do at the BBC and other broadcasters, of course, for keeping us in touch. You know, I don't suppose I don't think we're probably alone in being watching more news and listening to more news than we've ever done before. So thank you for that. But most importantly for tonight, for sharing with us the stories of you, both with broadcasting and with amateur radio. They've been absolutely fascinating and riveting from all the comments that we've got. And we'd like to thank you very much, Laurie.
Yeah, been a great pleasure. Lovely to talk to all of you. I know there's one or two call signs I know out there, but we hope to see you on the air or wherever before too terribly long. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And that's it. And that's from Laurie. So thanks once again to Laurie. And thanks ever so much for you all for bearing with us as well this evening. We know we've had some technical challenges, but what we can assure you is that we have been recording this digitally. And so if we find that the recording that's normally left on Facebook isn't perfect, then we'll hopefully be able to upload a much better version, and we'll certainly let you know. So sorry for the technical challenges. As you can imagine, we'll be working very hard to find out what was going wrong, and we'll put it all right for next week, hopefully. But that's it. Just to let you know, again, a reminder that Monday we've got our Monday Night Net with on GB3NB at 7:30. On Wednesday on NARC Live here, Chris G3SVL talking to us about DXpeditions and about the funding and the role of DXpeditions. And of course, we'd love to hear all your stories and news and everything else. Please keep sending them to us so we can share them with everybody. Send them to this address. Have I just put you on the spot, Tammy? Sorry. radio@dcpmicro.com. That email address. If you can send us anything by 3 o'clock next Wednesday, including your guesses for the shack and things like that, then we would love to share them with the audience. Thanks once again to Laurie G3UML. And thank you very much for you at home for bearing with us and for watching as always. So from Tammy M0TC.
Goodbye.
And from me, David G7URP. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.